Frank Morrison woke up at sunrise, just like he had every day for the past 5 years. The old man stretched his arms and looked out the window of his small farmhouse. The 2 sons of New Eden Colony painted the sky in soft orange and pink colors. It was going to be another peaceful day. He walked to the kitchen where his wife Helen was already making coffee. She smiled at him and handed him a warm cup. Helen had gray hair now, but her eyes still sparkled the same way they did when Frank first met her 40 years ago. "Good morning, dear," Helen said. "The tomatoes are ready to pick today." Frank nodded and sipped his coffee. He loved their little garden. After 30 years in the military, growing things felt like a miracle. Every green leaf and red tomato reminded him that life was good here on New Eden Colony. The colony was a quiet place. Only 2,000 people lived there, mostly farmers and old folks like Frank and Helen. Everyone knew everyone else. The children played in the streets safely. The biggest excitement was usually the weekly market day, or when someone's cow got loose. Frank had been a Marine for most of his adult life. He fought in the Centauri War when he was young. Later, he served in the Outer Rim conflicts. He saw terrible things and did what needed to be done. But that was long ago. Now he just wanted to grow vegetables and spend time with his family. After breakfast, Frank walked outside to check on their small garden. The morning air was fresh and clean. He could hear birds singing in the trees. This was so different from the metal ships and dark space where he used to work. The communication device in their house started beeping. Frank hurried inside, hoping it was what he thought it was. Helen was already answering the call. "Grandpa Frank." "Grandma Helen." 2 excited voices called out from the screen. Frank's face broke into a huge smile. There were his grandchildren, Tommy and Sophie, calling from Earth. Tommy was 8 years old, with messy brown hair and a gap-toothed grin. Sophie was 6, with pigtails and bright blue eyes, just like her grandmother. "Hi, kids," Frank said, sitting down next to Helen. "How are you doing?" "I lost a tooth," Sophie announced, showing the gap in her smile. "The tooth fairy gave me 5 credits. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Helen said. Tommy bounced excitedly. "Grandpa, tell us about the space dragons again." Frank chuckled. There were no space dragons, but Tommy loved the stories Frank made up. "Well, this one time, there was a dragon as big as a space station, ... For the next hour, Frank told stories and listened to his grandchildren talk about school, friends, and their pet cat. This was the best part of his day. These calls reminded him why he fought so hard all those years ago. He fought so children like Tommy and Sophie could grow up safe and happy. When the call ended, Frank felt warm inside. His daughter Lisa was raising good kids. They were smart and kind and full of life. Frank would do anything to protect them. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Frank and Helen picked vegetables from their garden. The tomatoes were perfect, red, and ripe. Helen would make sauce with them later. Frank also picked some beans and carrots. Simple work, but it made him happy. Around noon, their neighbor Jim stopped by. Jim was a former Navy pilot who now raised chickens. He was about Frank's age, with white hair and laugh lines around his eyes. "Morning, Frank," Jim said. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Sure is," Frank replied. "How are your chickens?" "Laying more eggs than I know what to do with," Jim laughed. "Helen, would you like some fresh eggs?" "That would be lovely," Helen said. "I'll trade you some tomatoes." This was how life worked on New Eden Colony. People helped each other. They shared what they had. It was peaceful and good. In the afternoon, Frank sat in his favorite chair on the porch. He was reading a book about ancient Earth history. Helen was inside, working on a quilt for their new great-grandchild who would be born soon. Frank sometimes thought about his old life, the battles, the fear, the friends he lost. But those memories felt far away now, like they belonged to someone else. He was just a grandfather who grew vegetables and told stories. The colony had a small security force, but they mostly dealt with lost animals and minor disputes. The last real trouble was 3 years ago, when some teenagers spray-painted the school. The colony relied on regular patrols from the Terran Defense Force for protection. But nothing ever happened on New Eden Colony. That evening, Frank and Helen walked to the town center for dinner at the community hall. Every Friday, the whole colony got together for a meal. It was a nice tradition. Frank liked seeing all the families together. The children ran around playing games while the adults talked. Frank watched Tommy's age group of kids and remembered his own grandchildren. They lived so far away on Earth, but these colony children reminded him of them. Old Pete, who ran the general store, was telling jokes. Mary, the schoolteacher, was organizing a game for the younger kids. Dr. Liu was checking on Mrs. Patterson's arthritis. Everyone had a place and a purpose. Frank looked around at all these good people living their quiet lives. Farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, retirees like himself. None of them wanted trouble. They just wanted to live in peace, raise their families, and enjoy their simple pleasures. As the evening wound down, Frank and Helen walked home under the stars. The night sky on New Eden Colony was beautiful. With no big cities nearby, you could see thousands of stars and a nearby nebula that painted part of the sky purple. "This is a good life," Helen said, taking Frank's hand. "Yes," Frank agreed. "It's exactly what we worked for." They went to bed that night with no idea that their peaceful world was about to change forever. Frank Morrison had earned his rest, but the galaxy was about to remind him that some fights never really end. The ships came at noon on a Tuesday. Frank was in his garden, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants. Helen was inside making lunch. It was supposed to be just another normal day on New Eden Colony. The first sign of trouble was when the sky suddenly got dark. Frank looked up and saw 3 massive shapes blocking out the sun. They were ships, but not human ships. These were long and sharp, with a dark metal that seemed to absorb light. Frank's blood went cold. He knew those ships. Zephyrian war cruisers. The emergency sirens started wailing across the colony. Frank dropped his gardening tools and ran inside. Helen was already at the window, staring up at the ships with wide eyes. "Frank, what are those?" she asked. "Trouble," Frank said. He grabbed her hand. "Big trouble." The colony's communication system crackled to life. "All residents, this is colony control. We have unknown vessels in our space. Please remain calm and stay in your homes until further notice." But Frank knew this was not a time to stay calm. He had fought the Zephyrians before, 20 years ago, during the Outer Rim conflicts. They were a warrior race that looked like giant insects with hard shells covering their bodies. They had 4 arms and faces that looked like they were made for biting. Most importantly, they did not negotiate. They took what they wanted. A new voice came through the communication system, but this one was not human. It was harsh and clicking, like metal scraping against metal. "Humans of New Eden Colony," the alien voice said. "I am Battle Commander Vexthara of the Zephyrian Hegemony. Your colony sits on territory that now belongs to us. You have 6 hours to leave this planet. Take only what you can carry. Any who remain after 6 hours will be removed permanently." Frank felt his old soldier instincts kick in. He knew that tone of voice. The Zephyrians had done this before to other colonies. They would give people just enough time to panic, but not enough time to organize or fight back. "Frank, we have to pack," Helen said. But Frank was already moving. He went to their bedroom and pulled out an old trunk from under the bed. Inside were things he had not touched in 5 years. his old military uniform, his service medals, a few weapons he had kept, just in case. At the bottom was a small device that looked like a regular communication unit, but Frank knew it was much more. "Helen, start packing our important things," Frank said. "Pictures, documents, medicine." "Only what?" "We need." Helen nodded and started moving, but Frank could see she was scared. He was scared too, but he was also angry. These aliens had no right to come here and threaten his peaceful life. Frank turned on the special communication device. It was connected to an old military network that most people had forgotten about. He typed in a coded message and sent it out into space. Outside, the colony was in chaos. Frank could hear people running and shouting. Cars were starting up as families tried to get to the spaceport. The colony only had a few transport ships, not nearly enough for everyone. Frank and Helen joined the crowd heading toward the town center. The colony's small defense force was trying to organize the evacuation, but they were overwhelmed. These were security guards, not soldiers. They had never faced anything like this. Old Pete was crying because he could not carry all his books. Mary the teacher was helping calm the children, but Frank could see the fear in her eyes. Dr. Liu was trying to move his medical equipment, but there was no way to take it all. "This is not right," Helen said. "We built this place. We made it our home." Frank squeezed her hand. "I know, but we need to get you safe first." The spaceport was a disaster. 3 small transport ships sat on the landing pad, but they could only carry about 300 people each. With 2,000 colonists, most people would be left behind. Captain Rodriguez, the head of colony security, was trying to organize the evacuation. "Families with children first," he shouted. "Everyone else, please be patient." But Frank could see the math. There was not enough time or space for everyone. The Zephyrians knew this. They always did this on purpose. That was when the first attack came. A small Zephyrian fighter ship dropped down from the main cruisers. It was fast and mean-looking, with weapons that glowed green. The pilot was probably young and eager to prove himself. Frank watched in horror as the fighter opened fire on the evacuation area. Green energy beams cut through the air like deadly lightning. The community center, where many families were waiting, took a direct hit. The building exploded in fire and smoke. Frank heard screaming. People were running everywhere, some on fire, others bleeding. The smell of burned metal and worse things filled the air. Frank saw little Maria, who was only 5 years old, lying on the ground, not moving. Her mother was crying over her. Mr. Chun, who taught music to the children, was not getting up from where he fell. Children. They had killed children. Helen grabbed Frank's arm. "We have to help them." But Frank was not moving. He was staring at the destruction with an expression Helen had never seen before. His face was very calm, but his eyes were cold as winter space. "Frank?" Helen said quietly. When Frank looked at her, Helen saw something that made her step back. The gentle grandfather who told stories and grew tomatoes was gone. In his place was someone else. Someone harder and more dangerous. "Helen," Frank said in a voice like ice, "get to the transport ships. Help organize the evacuation." "What about?" "You? I have work to do." Frank walked away from the chaos, moving against the crowd of panicking colonists. He walked with purpose, like a man who had made a decision. Behind him, the Zephyrian fighter was circling back for another attack. The pilot was probably laughing inside his ship. To him, these were just weak humans running around like scared animals. He had no idea that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. Frank reached his house and went straight to the basement. Behind false walls and under hidden panels, he had kept more than just a few old weapons. He had kept everything. Body armor that still fit. Weapons that still worked. And most importantly, intelligence files on every alien military force he had ever fought. Frank began to put on his armor with practiced speed. Each piece snapped into place like it was welcoming him home. The helmet's display came alive, showing him tactical information about the ships overhead. But first, he activated the special communication device again. This time, he sent a different message. A very specific message to very specific people. The message was simple. The children are threatened. I'm calling in all debts. We're coming out of retirement. Frank Morrison, grandfather and gardener, was gone. In his place stood Gunnery Sergeant Morrison, Marine Corps, veteran of 2 wars, and killer of those who threatened the innocent. The Zephyrians thought they were attacking a helpless farming colony. They were about to learn they had awakened something much more dangerous. Something that had been sleeping quietly in gardens and rocking chairs across human space. Something that did not like being disturbed. Frank's basement looked like any other basement. Old furniture, storage boxes, and garden tools. But Frank pressed a hidden switch, and everything changed. The walls slid away to reveal a room that did not belong in a peaceful farmhouse. Weapons hung on the walls in perfect order. Computer screens showed star maps and tactical data. Everything was clean and ready, as if Frank had been waiting for this day. Frank put on his old combat armor piece by piece. The suit was black and gray, designed for stealth and protection. It still fit perfectly. The helmet's display showed him information about the enemy ships overhead. 3 Zephyrian cruisers, each carrying about 200 soldiers. While Frank prepared, his special communication device started beeping. Messages were coming in from across human space. The old network was waking up. Jake here. Mining station in the Vega system. On my way. Betty checking in. Teaching job was getting boring anyway. Danny Murphy. My ship is fueled and ready. Those bugs picked the wrong fight. More messages kept coming. All across human space, people were getting Frank's call. People who used to be soldiers, pilots, and special forces. People who had retired to quiet lives, but kept their skills sharp. People who remembered what it meant to protect the innocent. Frank smiled for the first time since the attack. He was not alone. He picked up his old rifle, a weapon he had not touched in 5 years. It was a military-grade plasma rifle that could punch through alien armor. He checked the power cell and the targeting system. Everything worked perfectly. Frank climbed back upstairs and looked out the window. The evacuation was still happening, but it was a disaster. The transport ships were overloaded. Families were being separated. Children were crying for their parents. The Zephyrian fighter was making another attack run. This time, it was targeting the spaceport itself, trying to destroy the transport ships. Frank opened his window and aimed his rifle. The fighter was fast, but Frank had been shooting down enemy aircraft for 30 years. He led the target, adjusted for wind, and fired. The plasma beam hit the fighter in the engine. The ship spun out of control and crashed into the empty field beyond the town. Frank watched the explosion and felt a cold satisfaction. One down, but the main ships were still up there, and they had noticed the loss of their fighter. Frank's helmet display showed him movement on the cruisers. They were launching more fighters and preparing landing craft. Frank needed to get to the colony's command center. It was a small building near the spaceport with communication equipment and some basic defensive systems. Not much, but it would have to do. He ran through the town, avoiding the panicking crowds. People were still trying to evacuate, but Frank could see it was hopeless. There was not enough time or space for everyone. At the command center, Frank found Captain Rodriguez trying to coordinate the evacuation. Rodriguez was a good man, but he was a security officer, not a soldier. He looked lost. Rodriguez, Frank said, Walking into the building, Rodriguez turned around and his eyes went wide. Frank was in full combat armor, carrying military weapons. He looked like death itself. "Frank, what are you doing?" "Taking command," Frank said simply. "You're doing evacuation." "I'm doing defense." "Frank, we can't fight them. We have to get people out. We're going to do both." Frank sat down at the main communication console and began working. His fingers moved across the controls like he had never stopped being a soldier. The colony's defensive systems were basic, but Frank knew how to use them. First, he activated the emergency shields around the spaceport. Energy barriers flickered to life, protecting the transport ships from enemy fire. Then he turned on the colony's sensor array and began tracking the enemy ships. "Frank," Rodriguez said, "there are 3 cruisers up there. We have maybe 20 security officers with basic weapons. This is suicide." "No," Frank said calmly. "This is tactics." Frank's communication device beeped again. This time it was a direct call, not a message. "Frank, this is Jake. I'm 2 hours out. What's your situation?" 3 cruisers, about 600 enemy soldiers. They're preparing to land. Can you hold for 2 hours? Frank looked at the tactical display. The Zephyrians were launching landing craft, big, armored ships that could carry 50 soldiers each. They would be on the ground in 20 minutes. "I'll hold," Frank said. "What about the evacuation?" Frank looked out the window at the chaos. Families were still boarding the transport ships, but it was taking too long. The children were scared. The old people were confused. It was exactly what the Zephyrians wanted. "The evacuation continues," Frank said. "I'll buy them time." Frank turned to Rodriguez. "I need you to keep loading those ships. Get the children out first, then the elderly. Don't stop until everyone is gone." "What about you?" "I'm staying." Rodriguez stared at Frank for a long moment. Then he nodded. "What do you need?" "Get me every weapon we have, every piece of military equipment, and find me anyone who has military experience." Rodriguez started making calls. Within 10 minutes, Frank had a small group of volunteers. Jim, his neighbor, who used to be a Navy pilot, Mrs. Patterson, who looked like a sweet old lady but used to be a demolitions expert, young Sam, who was colony security but had trained with the Marines. 8 people total. Against 600, Frank looked at his tiny army and smiled. Well, this should be interesting. The first landing craft was coming down. Frank watched it on the sensors as it approached the colony. It was big and ugly, bristling with weapons. It would land in the town square in 5 minutes. "Here's what we're going to do," Frank said to his team. "We're not going to fight them head on. We're going to make them think they're fighting ghosts." Frank began giving orders. Jim would take the communication equipment and jam the enemy signals. Mrs. Patterson would set up explosive traps at key locations. Sam would coordinate the security officers to protect the evacuation. Frank himself would do what he did best: hunt. The first landing craft touched down in the town square. The rear ramp dropped open, and Zephyrian soldiers poured out. They were tall and insect-like, with hard shells covering their bodies. They carried energy weapons and moved in perfect formation. Frank watched them from the shadows between 2 buildings. The Zephyrians were good soldiers, but they were used to fighting in open space or on barren worlds. They were not used to fighting in a place where every building could hide an enemy. Frank raised his rifle and aimed at the leader. The Zephyrian was bigger than the others, with more decorations on his armor. Frank fired once. The plasma beam hit the leader in the chest. His armor cracked, and he fell backward. The other Zephyrians immediately took cover and started shooting at shadows. Frank was already gone, moving through the buildings like a ghost. He knew every alley, every rooftop. every hiding place in the colony. This was his home, and he was defending it. The battle for New Eden Colony had begun. The war for New Eden Colony was not like the battles Frank had fought before. This was not armies meeting on open ground. This was something more personal. This was an old man protecting his home. Frank moved through the colony like a shadow. He knew every building, every path, every hiding place. The Zephyrians had superior numbers and weapons, but Frank had something they did not understand. He had 40 years of experience and the rage of a grandfather whose peace had been shattered. The first squad of Zephyrians was searching the area where Frank had shot their leader. They moved carefully, checking every doorway and window. Frank watched them from the roof of the bakery, completely invisible. When they passed beneath him, Frank dropped down behind the last soldier. His combat knife slid between the plates of the alien's armor, and the Zephyrian died without making a sound. Frank dragged the body into an alley and disappeared before the others noticed. 2 minutes later, the squad realized one of their members was missing. They started calling out in their clicking language, but there was no answer. Frank was already stalking the next target. While Frank hunted, his small team was causing chaos throughout the colony. Mrs. Patterson had placed explosive charges in key locations. When the second landing craft arrived, she detonated the charges and brought down a bridge, cutting the colony in half. Jim was working his magic with the communication equipment. The Zephyrians found that their radios were full of static. Their targeting systems were malfunctioning. Their coordination was falling apart. What is happening down there? Battle Commander Vex Thara demanded from his ship. Sir, we are experiencing technical difficulties, his lieutenant reported. Our soldiers are reporting ghost attacks, equipment failures. We have lost contact with several squads. Impossible. These are just farmers. But it was not impossible. Frank and his team were turning the colony into a nightmare for the invaders. Every shadow might hide an enemy. Every building might be a trap. Every step forward might be their last. Frank's communication device buzzed. It was Jake, calling from space. Frank, this is Jake. I'm 1 hour out. How are you holding? Still here, Frank replied as he reloaded his rifle. But they're bringing in more troops. Help is coming. Betty is 30 minutes behind me. Danny is coming from the other direction. Frank smiled grimly. Good, I have a present for them. While Frank had been hunting Zephyrians, he had also been working on a bigger plan. He had hacked into the colony's computer systems and found something interesting. The Zephyrians had to land their ships to deploy all their soldiers, but that made them vulnerable. Frank made his way to the colony's power plant. It was a small building that generated energy for the whole settlement. More importantly, it was connected to the colony's defensive grid. The power plant was guarded by a full squad of Zephyrians. Frank counted 12 soldiers, all armed with heavy weapons. A direct attack would be suicide, but Frank did not attack directly. Instead, he waited and watched. He studied their patrol patterns, their communication schedules, their weak points. Frank had all the time in the world, because he was not just a soldier anymore. He was a predator. When the time was right, Frank struck. He used his rifle's silencer mode to pick off the guards one by one. The Zephyrians never saw him coming. Within 10 minutes, all 12 soldiers were dead. Frank entered the power plant and began working on the control systems. This was the tricky part. He needed to overload the defensive grid at exactly the right moment. His communication device buzzed again. This time, it was a new voice. Frank, this is Betty. I'm in the system. My ship is disguised as a medical transport. Good, Frank replied. Get ready for fireworks. Betty Rodriguez had been an intelligence officer for 20 years before she became a teacher. Her medical transport was actually a heavily armed spy ship with advanced electronic warfare capabilities. Frank, I'm reading 3 cruisers and multiple landing craft. What's your plan? I'm going to blind them. Then you and Jake hit them while they're confused. Frank finished his work on the power plant and moved to the next part of his plan. He needed to get to the colony's communication tower. It was the tallest building in the settlement, and it had a clear view of the entire battlefield. The tower was heavily guarded, but Frank did not need to fight his way in. He knew a secret way up through the maintenance tunnels. Within minutes, he was at the top of the tower, with a perfect view of the enemy positions. Frank activated his special communication device and sent a coded signal to his allies. All units, this is base. Execute Plan Alpha in 60 seconds. Down in the colony, Mrs. Patterson received the signal. She had been placing explosive charges all morning, and now it was time to use them. She pressed a button on her detonator. The explosions lit up the colony like a fireworks show. But these were not random explosions. Each charge was placed to cut power lines, disrupt communications, and create maximum confusion. The Zephyrian forces suddenly found themselves in complete darkness. Their night vision systems were not working. Their communication systems were down. They were scattered across the colony with no way to coordinate. That was when Jake arrived. Frank watched from the tower as Jake's mining ship dropped out of hyperspace. It looked like a normal cargo vessel, but when it got closer, hidden weapons revealed themselves. Jake's ship opened fire on the first Zephyrian cruiser. The aliens were caught completely off guard. They had been focused on the ground battle and did not expect an attack from space. Betty arrived 30 seconds later. Her ship launched a cyber attack that shut down the Zephyrian targeting systems. The enemy cruisers could not shoot back effectively, but the real surprise came from the third direction. Danny Murphy's repair shuttle turned out to be a stealth fighter with advanced weapons. He hit the second cruiser before they even knew he was there. "This is for the children. You bugs," Danny said over the communication channel. Frank watched the space battle from his tower and felt a cold satisfaction. But the fight was not over. The third cruiser was still operational, and there were still hundreds of Zephyrian soldiers on the ground. That was when Frank activated the final part of his plan. He had been saving the best for last. Frank connected his communication device to the colony's broadcasting system. When he spoke, his voice went out to every ship in the system, including the Zephyrian cruisers. "Attention Zephyrian forces," Frank said in a calm, cold voice. "This is Gunnery Sergeant Frank Morrison, Human Marine Corps. You made a mistake when you came here. You killed children. You threatened my family. You disturbed my peace." Frank paused and looked out at the burning colony below. "I am 68 years old. I have fought in 2 wars. I have killed enemies on a dozen worlds. I came here to retire, to grow vegetables and tell stories to my grandchildren. But you could not leave us alone." Battle Commander Vexthara was listening to this broadcast from his ship. He had been confident when the attack began, but now his forces were scattered and confused. 2 of his cruisers were damaged or destroyed. Who was this human? "You want to know what you're fighting?" Frank continued. "You're not fighting farmers. You're fighting people who earned their peace. Every human colony has people like me. People who put down their weapons and picked up gardening tools, but who never forgot how to use those weapons." Frank's voice grew even colder. "You can surrender now and leave our space. Or you can learn why we were able to retire in the first place." The battle for New Eden Colony was about to enter its final phase. Battle Commander Vexthara stared at the tactical display on his ship's bridge. 2 hours ago, he had been confident. His forces were attacking a weak farming colony full of elderly humans and children. It should have been easy. Now 2 of his cruisers were destroyed. His ground forces were scattered and confused. And somehow, A handful of old humans were winning. "Sir," his lieutenant reported, "we are receiving surrender requests from several of our ground units. They say they are surrounded and under heavy fire." "Impossible," Vextara clicked. "How many humans are down there?" "Our best estimate is maybe 10 active fighters." 10. 10 humans were defeating 600 Zephyrian soldiers. Vextara looked at the communication screen where Frank's face had appeared. The human looked old, with gray hair and wrinkles around his eyes. But those eyes were the coldest thing Vextara had ever seen. "Human," Vextara said, "you cannot defeat the Zephyrian hegemony. We have thousands of ships, millions of soldiers." Frank's expression did not change. "Maybe, but you're not fighting the Zephyrian hegemony right now. You're fighting me, and I'm having a very bad day." Down in the colony, the battle was almost over. Frank's small team had turned the Zephyrian invasion into a disaster. The aliens were used to fighting in open space or on barren worlds. They were not prepared for urban warfare against people who knew every inch of the battlefield. Mrs. Patterson had been particularly effective. Her explosive traps had destroyed 3 landing craft and cut the enemy forces in half. The Zephyrians were now trapped in small groups, with no way to coordinate. Jim had completely jammed their communication systems. The enemy soldiers were fighting blind, unable to call for help or receive orders. Many were surrendering rather than face the ghostly attacks that seemed to come from everywhere. But Frank was not done. He had one more surprise for the Zephyrians. While the battle raged, more help had arrived. Word of Frank's call had spread through the old military networks. Retired soldiers from across human space were coming to New Eden Colony. A former Navy captain named Ruth brought her cargo ship, which was actually a disguised destroyer. An old Air Force pilot named Mike arrived with a fighter squadron hidden inside fake civilian transports. Even a retired Marine general named Carl came with a small fleet of merchant vessels that turned out to be military ships. Within 3 hours, Frank had assembled a force of 30 ships and over 200 former military personnel. All of them were officially retired. All of them were supposed to be living quiet lives. All of them were very angry about what the Zephyrians had done to the children. "Frank," Ruth's voice came over the communication channel, "we've got the remaining cruisers surrounded. What are your orders?" Frank looked down at the colony from his position in the communications tower. The evacuation was almost complete. The last transport ship was loading the final group of civilians. Soon, everyone would be safe. "Give them one chance," Frank said. "Standard terms?" Ruth opened a channel to the Zephyrian cruiser. "Zephyrian vessel, this is Captain Ruth Miller, Human Navy retired. You are surrounded and outgunned. Surrender now or be destroyed." Battle Commander Vextara looked at his tactical display. Somehow, he was now facing a human fleet that had appeared out of nowhere. How was this possible? "This is impossible," he said to his lieutenant. "These are supposed to be retired humans. Old people living on farms?" "Sir?" the lieutenant replied nervously. "Perhaps that is exactly why they are so dangerous." Vextara was beginning to understand. These humans had not gotten soft in retirement. They had gotten smarter, more patient, more deadly. Frank's voice came through the communication system again. "Battle Commander, you have 30 seconds to decide. Surrender and leave our space, or find out what happens when you really make us angry." Vextara looked at his remaining forces. Most of his ground troops were dead or captured. His other ships were destroyed. He was facing a human fleet that seemed to have magic powers, appearing from nowhere and fighting like they had nothing to lose. "We surrender," Vextara said quietly. "Louder," Frank said. "We surrender." Vextara shouted. Frank smiled for the first time since the battle began. Good choice. The remaining Zephyrian forces were quickly rounded up. The ground troops came out of hiding with their hands raised. The cruiser powered down its weapons. Within an hour, the battle for New Eden Colony was over. Frank climbed down from the communications tower and walked through the colony. The damage was extensive, but most of the buildings could be repaired. More importantly, most of the people had survived. Helen was waiting for him at the spaceport. She had helped coordinate the evacuation and made sure every child got safely onto the transport ships. When she saw Frank walking toward her, still in his combat armor, she ran to meet him. "Is it over?" she asked. "It's over," Frank said, taking off his helmet. The gentle grandfather was back in his eyes. They held each other while the cleanup began around them. The other retired soldiers were helping with the wounded and organizing the prisoners. Everyone worked together like they had never stopped being a military unit. But Frank was not quite finished. He had one more message to send. Frank went back to the communications center and activated the colony's long-range transmitter. This message would go out to every world in known space. Every government, every military force, every species that might be listening. "This is Gunnery Sergeant Frank Morrison, speaking from New Eden Colony," Frank said into the transmitter. "Today, the Zephyrian hegemony attacked our peaceful settlement. They killed children. They threatened innocent families. They made a very serious mistake." Frank paused and looked out at the colony where people were already beginning to rebuild. "I want everyone listening to understand something about humans. We do not want war. We want to live in peace. We want to grow our food, raise our families, and tell stories to our grandchildren. But if you threaten our young, if you attack our homes, if you force us to get up from our comfortable chairs, you will discover why we were able to earn that comfort in the first place." Frank's voice grew harder. "Every human colony, every human settlement, every human retirement community contains people like me. People who put down their weapons to pick up gardening tools. People who chose peace but never forgot how to make war. We are teachers and farmers and shopkeepers now. But we used to be soldiers." The message was being recorded and transmitted across the galaxy. On 1,000 worlds, alien governments were listening to the words of an angry grandfather. "Leave us alone," Frank continued. "Let us live in peace. Let us raise our children and tend our gardens. Because if you make us get up from our rocking chairs, if you force us to remember what we used to be, you will not like what you find." Frank turned off the transmitter and walked outside. The colony was already coming back to life. People were returning from the evacuation ships. Children were playing again. The daily routine of peaceful life was beginning to return. 2 days later, Frank was back in his garden. The tomatoes had been damaged in the fighting, but most of them could be saved. Helen was inside, making lunch and humming quietly to herself. Frank's communication device beeped. It was a call from Earth. Tommy and Sophie appeared on the screen, excited and chattering. "Grandpa Frank, Grandpa Frank, Mom says you had an adventure." Frank smiled and sat down to talk to his grandchildren. "Well, there was a little excitement here, but everything is fine now." "Did you fight space monsters?" Tommy asked with wide eyes. "Something like that," Frank said. "But the most important thing is that everyone is safe." Sophie leaned closer to the screen. "Grandpa, will you tell us a story?" "Of course, sweetheart." Once upon a time, there was a very peaceful garden. While Frank told stories to his grandchildren, reports were spreading across the galaxy. The Zephyrian attack on New Eden Colony had become a legend. Every alien government was updating their files on human space. The message was simple: do not threaten human civilians, do not attack human colonies, and most importantly, never ever make a human grandparent get up from their chair. Frank Morrison finished his story and said goodbye to his grandchildren. Then he went back to his garden, where Helen was waiting with a cup of coffee. "Peaceful retirement," Helen said with a smile. The most dangerous kind, Frank replied. They sat together in their garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in beautiful colors. Around them, New Eden Colony was rebuilding. Children were laughing. Families were reuniting. Life was returning to normal. And across the galaxy, alien governments were very quietly deciding that human space was not worth the trouble. Frank Morrison, grandfather and gardener, had reminded the universe why humans were left alone to live in peace. Sometimes the most dangerous warriors were the ones who just wanted to grow tomatoes and tell bedtime stories. The galaxy had learned its lesson. Never wake a sleeping human, never threaten their young, and never, ever make them get up from their comfortable retirement. Because some people's rest is everyone else's safety.